The journey begins. Jamal stood at the edge of the bustling airport terminal, the oversized straps of his tattered backpack clinging to his narrow shoulders. His small, worn sneakers shuffled nervously on the polished floor as travelers hurried past him, their rolling suitcases humming like bees in a hive. Jamal felt out of place among the well-dressed families and business professionals, each lost in their own worlds of schedules and destinations. He gripped the paper boarding pass in his hand tightly, as though letting go would dissolve the courage he had summoned to make this journey. The boarding gate loomed ahead, its digital sign glowing with the name of a city he had never seen before, Washington, D.C. The thought of flying, something he had never done, filled him with a mix of excitement and apprehension. Jamal's palms felt clammy as he stepped forward, his turn in line approaching. "Next, please," called the gate agent, her voice clear and professional. Jamal took a deep breath and approached the counter, offering his boarding pass with trembling fingers. The agent, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes softened by a kind smile, glanced at him curiously. "Traveling alone, young man?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yes, ma'am," Jamal replied softly, barely audible over the ambient noise of the terminal. Her smile widened. "Well, you're quite brave. Don't worry, we'll take good care of you." As Jamal stepped onto the jet bridge, the distant roar of the airplane engines grew louder, making his stomach churn. The confined space of the bridge and the steady hum of the ventilation system made him feel even smaller. He hesitated at the aircraft door, where a flight attendant greeted him with a professional but slightly faltering smile. Inside the plane, Jamal felt the weight of countless eyes on him. He imagined what the passengers might be thinking. Who is this scruffy boy? Where are his parents? Despite their curiosity, most people quickly turned back to their phones or magazines when he met their gaze. "Let me help you find your seat," offered Linda, a flight attendant with carefully styled hair and a name tag pinned to her crisp uniform. Jamal nodded and followed her, clutching his backpack tightly. The weight of his entire life seemed contained in that worn bag. He tried to stay out of everyone's way, but the cramped aisle made it hard not to bump into passengers or their belongings. He heard whispers as he passed, a mix of pity and judgment that made his cheeks flush with embarrassment. When they reached his assigned seat by the window, Linda pointed to the overhead bin. "You can place your bag up here, or under the seat in front of you." Jamal hesitated, opting to keep the bag at his feet. He slid into the window seat and stared out at the tarmac, avoiding the glances of passengers around him. His reflection in the thick window glass revealed a face both nervous and determined. The chatter of the cabin grew louder as more passengers boarded, and Jamal did his best to remain invisible. He fumbled with his seatbelt, stealing glances at how others secured theirs. The click of the buckle finally brought a small wave of relief, though his heart continued to race. As the flight prepared for takeoff, Jamal's throat felt parched from his nerves. He raised his hand hesitantly, catching Linda's attention as she passed by with a drink cart. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said softly. "Could I have some water?" Linda nodded, pouring water into a plastic cup and handing it to him. But as Jamal reached for it, his fingers slipped, and the water spilled across his lap. Worse, a few drops splattered onto the businessman seated beside him, who jerked back with an audible gasp. "My suit," the man exclaimed, dabbing at his trousers with a napkin. "This is custom-tailored." "I'm sorry," Jamal stammered, grabbing at his own shirt to dry the man's pants. Linda hurried to the scene with more napkins, but the murmurs of nearby passengers only made the situation worse. "That boy should be more careful," whispered a woman behind him. "He looks like he's never flown before," added another voice. Jamal's face burned as he apologized again and again. He fumbled with his backpack, trying to make space for the man beside him to dry off. But his nervous hands couldn't get a proper grip, and the bag slipped, landing on a passenger in the aisle seat. "Watch it," the woman snapped, rubbing her shoulder where the bag had struck. "I'm sorry," Jamal repeated, his voice cracking. Linda's expression shifted from professional concern to thinly veiled irritation. "Young man," she said firmly, placing a hand on his shoulder, "I think we need to have a talk about proper behavior on an airplane." Jamal's eyes darted around the cabin, his embarrassment morphing into a sinking sense of dread. The judgmental stares of the passengers felt like a spotlight, trapping him in a moment he couldn't escape. Linda leaned closer, her voice low but serious. "Are you sure you're supposed to be on this flight? Do you have any documents or paperwork with you?" Jamal nodded, pulling out his crumpled boarding pass. He handed it to her, his hands trembling. Linda examined the pass, her eyes narrowing. "And where are your parents?" "I'm traveling alone," Jamal whispered. The businessman beside him muttered, "This is ridiculous. He's clearly not ready to be on his own." Linda sighed and straightened up. "Wait here," she said, stepping toward the front of the plane with the boarding pass in hand. As she spoke into the crew phone, Jamal's heart pounded. He clenched the straps of his backpack, the edges of the fabric digging into his palms. He didn't understand why this was happening. He had followed all the rules. He had come this far. Minutes later, Linda returned with an airport staff member. Her tone was polite but firm. "I'm sorry, young man, but we need to verify some details before you can fly. Please gather your belongings." "But I have to get to Washington," Jamal pleaded, his voice shaking. "It's important." "I'm sure it is," Linda said, her tone softening slightly. "We just need to ensure everything is in order." Jamal's legs felt like lead as he stood and retrieved his bag. The walk down the aisle, past the murmuring passengers, felt endless. Each step echoed in his ears, drowning out his thoughts. When he reached the jet bridge, he turned back to glance at the plane's interior one last time. The pitying eyes of strangers met his gaze, and Linda's expression held a mix of concern and doubt. Jamal stepped onto the bridge, the airport staff member guiding him away. His heart felt heavy, but a flicker of determination remained. He wasn't just a boy traveling alone. He was a boy on a mission, one that had to succeed, no matter what obstacles stood in his way. A journey disrupted. The airport terminal hummed with activity, its polished floors reflecting the overhead lights and the hurried steps of travelers. Jamal stood awkwardly by the counter where the airport staff had led him, his backpack still clutched tightly to his chest. His heart raced, a mixture of fear and frustration bubbling inside him. He didn't understand why they had removed him from the plane. He wasn't causing trouble, at least not on purpose. "Sit tight for a moment," said the staff member, a kind-looking man with graying hair and a name tag that read Mr. Grant. "We just need to clear up a few things." Jamal nodded silently, his throat too dry to respond. He slid onto a nearby bench, the hard plastic cool against his legs. Around him, the terminal buzzed with life, but he felt frozen, disconnected from the busy world that swirled around him. As he waited, Jamal's thoughts drifted to the reason for his trip. His mind replayed the moment he had received the letter, carefully folded and addressed to him, with the official seal of the White House embossed at the top. It had been delivered to the community center where he lived, and when he read the words, "Presidential Medal of Valor," his hands had shaken. The recognition was for his bravery during the recent bombing at the Central Market. That day, amid chaos and danger, Jamal had acted instinctively. He didn't think about the risk to himself when he guided an elderly vendor to safety or when he helped a young mother with her infant escape the smoke and debris. It wasn't heroism, he thought. It was just the right thing to do. But now, that sense of purpose felt distant, overshadowed by the humiliation of being removed from the flight. What if he couldn't get to Washington in time for the ceremony? What if the people waiting for him thought he didn't care enough to show up? "Excuse me, young man," said Mr. Grant, pulling Jamal from his thoughts. The older man crouched slightly to meet Jamal's eye level. "We've contacted the airline and reviewed your ticket. Everything seems to check out. I'm sorry for the inconvenience." Jamal felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly extinguished by Mr. Grant's next words. "Unfortunately, the flight you were on has already left. We'll need to rebook you on a later one." The words hit Jamal like a punch to the gut. He glanced at the clock on the wall, calculating the delay in his head. Every moment that passed felt like another missed opportunity to prove he deserved to stand on that stage. "I can't be late," Jamal said, his voice trembling. I have to be there." Mr. Grant's face softened. "Don't worry, son. We'll get you there. Let me see what I can do." Jamal watched as Mr. Grant walked away, his phone pressed to his ear. Left alone again, Jamal slumped against the bench. He stared at the floor, the weight of the day pressing down on him. A sudden noise jolted him, a voice, sharp and familiar. He looked up to see Linda, the flight attendant who had removed him from the plane, walking toward him. Her expression was a mix of surprise and something that looked like regret. "Jamal," she said, stopping a few feet away. "I didn't realize you were still here." Jamal stood, his grip tightening on his backpack. He didn't know what to say. The memory of her skeptical gaze, her clipped tone, was still fresh. I wanted to check on you," Linda continued, her voice gentler now. "I'm sorry if I was too harsh earlier. I didn't know." Her words trailed off, and Jamal realized she was looking at the crumpled piece of paper sticking out of his backpack. "What's that?" she asked, pointing to it. Jamal hesitated, then slowly pulled it out. He unfolded the letter, the thick paper creased from being read and reread. Linda's eyes scanned the official header, her expression shifting from confusion to shock. This is from the White House," she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jamal nodded. "They said I'm supposed to get an award." Linda's face went pale. She read the letter again, her lips moving silently over the words. When she finished, she looked at Jamal, her blue eyes wide with realization. "Oh my God," she murmured, pressing a hand to her chest. "You're the boy. The one from the news." Jamal felt a lump in his throat. He didn't want to be the boy from the news. He just wanted to be Jamal. "I didn't know," Linda said again, her voice breaking slightly. "I didn't know who you were. I'm so sorry." Jamal shrugged, not trusting himself to speak. Linda seemed to gather herself, standing straighter. "I'll fix this," she said firmly. "I'll make sure you get to Washington." Before Jamal could respond, she turned and walked briskly toward the counter where Mr. Grant was speaking with another staff member. He watched as she gestured animatedly, her hands moving as if she were pleading her case. Minutes later, Linda returned, her professional demeanor replaced by something more genuine. "They're arranging a new flight for you," she said, her tone kinder than it had been earlier. "It's a direct route, and I'll make sure you're boarded first." Jamal nodded, a small flicker of gratitude sparking in his chest. "Jamal," Linda said, her voice soft, "I misjudged you, and I can't tell you how sorry I am. You didn't deserve that." For the first time since stepping into the airport, Jamal felt a hint of relief. "Thank you," he said quietly. Linda smiled, a hint of sadness in her eyes. "No, Jamal. Thank you." As Jamal sat waiting for his new flight, the weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter. He still didn't know what awaited him in Washington, but he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This journey wasn't just about him anymore. It was about proving to himself and to the world that no matter how small or scared he felt, he could still make a difference. A hero's resolve. The airport was quieter now, with fewer passengers bustling about as the late afternoon stretched into evening. Jamal sat in a corner of the waiting area, clutching his backpack like a lifeline. His nerves felt frayed, but Linda's promise and the arrangements Mr. Grant had finalized gave him a glimmer of hope. The rebooked flight was still an hour away, and the weight of the day's events pressed heavily on Jamal. He replayed the moments on the plane, the humiliation of being removed, the judgmental stares of the passengers, and Linda's sharp tone when she questioned him. Yet there was also her apology, genuine and unexpected. "Hey there," a soft voice interrupted his thoughts. Jamal looked up to see Linda standing nearby, a tentative smile on her face. She wasn't wearing the polished, professional mask she had earlier. Her expression was warm, almost maternal, as she held 2 small cups of ice cream. "I thought you might like a treat," she said, holding one out to him. "It's the least I can do." Jamal hesitated before taking the cup. "Thank you," he said quietly. Linda sat on the bench across from him, her posture relaxed, as though trying to put him at ease. She watched him for a moment before speaking. "You know," she began, her voice thoughtful, "I've been a flight attendant for years, but I think today was the first time I truly stopped to think about the people behind the tickets." Jamal glanced at her, unsure how to respond. "I made a mistake, Jamal," Linda continued. "A big one. And I want you to know how sorry I am for what happened earlier." Jamal shrugged, spooning a small bite of ice cream into his mouth. "It's okay," he said, though he wasn't sure if he fully meant it. "No, it's not," Linda said firmly. "I assumed things about you that weren't fair. I let your age, your nervousness, even your clothes, I let all of that cloud my judgment. And I was wrong." Her words hung in the air between them, heavy but sincere. Jamal nodded, acknowledging her apology, but still feeling the sting of the day's events. "What's in Washington?" Linda asked gently, steering the conversation to safer ground. Jamal hesitated before answering. "An award," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Linda leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees. "The Presidential Medal of Valor, right?" Jamal's eyes widened. "You know about it?" She smiled. "I read your letter. I hope you don't mind. I wanted to understand what was so important." Jamal nodded slowly. "They said it's for what I did at the market," he explained. "But I didn't do anything special. I just helped." Linda's smile faded as she shook her head. "You risk your life to save others, Jamal. That's not just helping. That's extraordinary." Jamal looked down at his ice cream, suddenly feeling self-conscious. He didn't feel extraordinary. He felt like a scared kid who had stumbled into something far bigger than himself. "I'm not sure I even want it," he admitted after a moment. Linda frowned. "Why not?" Jamal shrugged. "Because, what if I don't deserve it? What if they're making a mistake?" Linda's gaze softened, and she reached across the small space between them to touch his arm lightly. "Jamal," she said, her voice firm but kind, "the people giving you this award aren't making a mistake. They see what you did, what you're capable of. And so do I." Jamal met her eyes, searching for any hint of doubt, but found none. "You're stronger than you think," Linda continued. "And what you did, whether you realize it or not, gave a lot of people hope. That's a gift." Jamal nodded, the weight of her words settling over him like a warm blanket. Maybe she was right. Maybe there was more to what he had done than he allowed himself to see. Their conversation was interrupted by an announcement over the intercom. "Flight 293 to Washington, D.C., now boarding at Gate 14. "That's you," Linda said, standing. She extended a hand to Jamal. "Come on, let's get you there." The boarding process was different this time. Linda stayed by Jamal's side, her presence a shield against the curious glances of other passengers. She spoke to the gate agent and escorted him onto the plane, ensuring he was settled into his seat before addressing the other flight attendants. "I want everyone to take extra care of this passenger," she said softly but firmly. Jamal watched her go, her words echoing in his mind. He leaned back against the seat, his backpack still safely tucked under his feet. The plane's engines rumbled to life, and as it began to taxi down the runway, Jamal felt a mixture of anxiety and determination rise within him. The flight to Washington was uneventful. For the first time that day, Jamal allowed himself to relax. He stared out the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. As the plane touched down, Jamal felt his heart race again. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for and dreading at the same time. The airport in Washington was grand and bustling, but Jamal barely noticed. He followed the signs to the baggage claim area, where Linda had arranged for an escort to meet him. A tall man in a dark suit stood waiting, holding a sign with Jamal's name. Jamal Thompson, the man asked, his voice polite but professional. Jamal nodded, clutching his backpack tighter. I'm Agent Carter, the man said, extending a hand. I'll be taking you to your hotel. The White House staff is expecting you tomorrow morning. Jamal shook his hand, his nerves returning in full force. He followed Agent Carter through the airport, the weight of the upcoming ceremony pressing down on him. As they stepped outside, the cool evening air hit Jamal's face, calming him slightly. A sleek black car waited at the curb, its polished exterior reflecting the city lights. Jamal climbed into the back seat, his eyes wide as they drove through the streets of Washington. Passing iconic landmarks he had only seen on TV, the car pulled up to a grand hotel, its entrance lit with warm golden lights. Bellhops in crisp uniforms greeted them, and Agent Carter handed Jamal a small envelope. Your room key, he said. Get some rest. Tomorrow is a big day. Jamal nodded, thanking him quietly before stepping inside. In his room, Jamal stood by the window, staring out at the city skyline. The Capitol building glowed in the distance, its dome a beacon against the dark sky. He felt small again, like the boy who had walked into the airport that morning, unsure of his place in the world. But then he thought of Linda's words, of the people who believed in him, and of the lives he had touched. Slowly, Jamal reached into his backpack and pulled out the letter from the White House. He read it again, this time with a new sense of purpose. He wasn't just here for himself. He was here for the people he had helped and for those who believed in what he had done. Taking a deep breath, Jamal folded the letter carefully and placed it back in his bag. He climbed into bed, the city lights casting faint patterns on the walls of his room. Tomorrow would be the start of something bigger than him, and he was ready, a hero's moment. Jamal woke to the sound of soft knocking on his hotel room door. He blinked at the early morning light streaming through the curtains, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. Then the reality of where he was and what the day held settled over him like a weight. Jamal, it's time to get ready. A voice called from the other side of the door. It was Agent Carter. Jamal slid out of bed, rubbing his eyes. His hands were trembling, and his heart raced as he thought about the ceremony. The Presidential Medal of Valor. He had read those words so many times on the letter, yet they still felt surreal. A warm breakfast had been delivered to his room, a spread of pancakes, fruit, and orange juice. Jamal picked at the food, his appetite dulled by nerves. He couldn't stop thinking about the questions that had swirled in his mind ever since he had been invited. Did he deserve this? What would people think of him when they saw him? A boy from a neighborhood most of them couldn't even imagine. By mid-morning, Jamal stood in front of a full-length mirror, dressed in a tailored navy blue suit. The hotel staff had insisted he have it made for the occasion. It fit perfectly, but he felt out of place in the pristine fabric. His reflection stared back at him, uncertain and small. Agent Carter entered the room, a reassuring smile on his face. You look sharp, Jamal. The car is waiting. Ready? Jamal nodded, though he wasn't sure if he truly was. The drive to the White House felt like a dream. Jamal pressed his face to the window, watching the city's landmarks blur past. When the car pulled up to the gated entrance, a wave of awe washed over him. The towering structure was both intimidating and beautiful, its gleaming white facade, a symbol he had only ever seen on TV. Security officers waved them through, and soon Jamal found himself in a grand reception area, the ceilings soaring high above him. The walls were lined with portraits of presidents and historical figures. A staff member greeted him warmly and led him to a waiting room where other guests were gathered. Jamal scanned the room, his eyes catching on the ornate furnishings and the impeccably dressed attendees. He felt out of place again, clutching his hands tightly to stop them from shaking. Jamal Thompson. A woman's voice broke through his thoughts. He turned to see a tall woman in a sleek gray suit approaching him. Her smile was kind but professional. I'm Samantha Green, she introduced herself. I'll be guiding you through today's events. Everyone's eager to meet you. Jamal nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Thank you," he managed to say. As the ceremony began, Jamal was ushered into the East Room, the largest and most elegant space he had ever seen. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, and sunlight streamed through tall windows draped with heavy curtains. Rows of chairs filled the room, occupied by dignitaries, journalists, and invited guests. At the front of the room stood a podium with the presidential seal. Behind it, the president himself waited, flanked by several high-ranking officials. Jamal's heart pounded as he was led to a reserved seat in the front row. The room quieted as the ceremony began. The master of ceremonies introduced the event, speaking about the importance of recognizing civilian bravery. Jamal's name was mentioned alongside a brief recounting of the events at the Central Market bombing. "Today, we honor a young hero," the speaker said, their voice carrying across the room. At just 11 years old, Jamal Thompson displayed extraordinary courage and selflessness during a moment of unimaginable chaos. His actions saved multiple lives and inspired a nation. The words felt heavy in Jamal's ears. He looked down at his hands, unsure if he could live up to the picture they were painting of him. When it was time for him to approach the podium, Jamal felt his legs tremble as he stood. The room seemed larger now, the distance to the stage impossibly long. Samantha gave him an encouraging nod as he began walking, his steps hesitant but steady. The applause that erupted as he ascended the stage was deafening. Jamal's cheeks flushed, and his gaze darted to the president, who extended a hand to greet him. "You've done something remarkable, Jamal," the president said warmly, shaking his hand. "You've shown us all what bravery looks like." Jamal nodded, unable to find the words to respond. The president took the medal, a gleaming piece of metal attached to a blue ribbon, and draped it carefully around Jamal's neck. The applause swelled again, and Jamal felt its weight settle against his chest, both physical and symbolic. Jamal stepped up to the microphone, the crowd still on their feet. His heart raced as he looked out at the sea of faces, all focused on him. He took a deep breath, remembering Linda's words, "You're stronger than you think." His voice cracked, but he pushed through. "I don't know what to say. I never thought I'd be here." The room was silent, the audience hanging on his every word. "When the bombing happened, I didn't think. I just saw people who needed help, and I couldn't walk away. I didn't do it to be a hero. I just did what I thought was right." His hands gripped the edges of the podium as he continued. "I'm here because so many people helped me get here. My community, my mentors, and people like Linda." His voice wavered at the mention of her name, "who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." Jamal paused, searching the faces in the crowd. "This medal isn't just for me. It's for everyone who showed me what kindness and courage look like. Thank you." The applause that followed was thunderous, shaking the room. Jamal stepped back, his heart pounding. He didn't know if his words were good enough, but the smiles and standing ovation told him they were. After the ceremony, Jamal was swarmed by reporters, dignitaries, and guests who wanted to shake his hand and congratulate him. It was overwhelming, but he tried to take it in stride. Samantha stayed close, guiding him through the crowd. When the event finally ended and Jamal returned to his hotel room, he collapsed onto the bed, staring at the ceiling. The medal rested on the bedside table, its polished surface catching the light. He felt different now, not because of the medal, but because of the people who had lifted him to this moment. For the first time, he believed in his own strength, and he knew that his journey was far from over. The world was big, and he was just one boy, but he had made a difference, and that meant he could do it again. From hero to advocate. The next morning, Jamal sat at the desk in his hotel room, the Presidential Medal of Valor resting beside him. Its polished surface gleamed in the sunlight streaming through the window, but Jamal's gaze was distant. The weight of the medal still felt surreal, both physically and emotionally. The applause, the accolades, and the president's handshake had all been overwhelming. Yet the words of his speech kept circling back in his mind. This medal isn't just for me. It's for everyone who showed me what kindness and courage look like. A soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. Agent Carter stepped inside, holding a thick folder and a clipboard. "Good morning, Jamal. How are you feeling?" he asked, his tone warm and casual. Jamal shrugged. "I'm okay, I guess." Carter placed the folder on the desk and sat across from him. "There's something I'd like to talk to you about. Last night's ceremony wasn't just about honoring you. It was about inspiring others. The White House has received countless messages from people who were moved by your story. You've made an impact, Jamal, and they're asking what's next for you." Jamal frowned. "What's next?" "I don't know. I mean, I'm just a kid." Carter smiled knowingly. "You may be young, but you've already shown the kind of courage and leadership that people twice your age aspire to. The question is, how do you want to use this moment?" Jamal stared at the medal, his mind racing. He thought about his community, the streets where he grew up, and the people who had shaped him. His heart ached for the kids he left behind. Kids like him, who needed opportunities but were often overlooked. "I want to help people," Jamal said finally, his voice quiet but resolute. "Especially kids like me." Carter nodded, leaning back in his chair. "That's a great start. We can connect you with organizations that focus on community development, education, and mentorship. You'd be a powerful advocate." Jamal bit his lip. The idea of being an advocate felt daunting, but it also felt right. Later that day, Jamal attended a roundtable discussion organized by the White House. The event brought together community leaders, activists, and educators from across the country. Jamal was the youngest person in the room by far, but his presence commanded attention. When the moderator invited him to speak, Jamal hesitated for only a moment before stepping up to the microphone. "Growing up, I didn't have much," Jamal began, his voice steady but raw. "But I had people who cared about me. My community taught me that even when you don't have money or power, you can still make a difference. That's what I want to do. Help kids in neighborhoods like mine see that they matter and that they have a future." The room erupted in applause. As Jamal returned to his seat, several attendees leaned over to shake his hand or offer words of encouragement. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Jamal returned to his hometown, where the entire community gathered for a welcome-back celebration. The streets were decorated with banners, and the air buzzed with excitement. Mrs. Rodriguez from the corner store handed him a bouquet of flowers, while Mr. Chen from the laundromat held up a sign that read, "Our hero, our Jamal." But Jamal's focus quickly shifted to action. Inspired by his conversations in Washington, he began brainstorming ways to make a lasting impact on his community. With the help of the local community center, he launched an initiative called Future Builders, aimed at providing mentorship, educational resources, and safe spaces for kids to grow and thrive. The program started small, with weekly tutoring sessions and workshops on topics like conflict resolution and creative writing. Jamal worked tirelessly, often staying late to help plan activities or talk to kids about their dreams. He used his story not as a way to boast, but as a way to show them what was possible. One afternoon, as Jamal was setting up for a workshop, Linda walked into the community center. She was no longer wearing her crisp flight attendant uniform, but her warm smile and kind eyes were unmistakable. "Linda," Jamal exclaimed, rushing over to greet her. "What are you doing here?" "I couldn't stay away," she replied. "I've been following your journey, Jamal, and I'm so proud of you. I wanted to see this place for myself." Jamal grinned, motioning for her to follow him. "Come on, I'll give you a tour." As they walked through the center, Linda marveled at the transformation. What had once been a small, underfunded space now buzzed with life. Kids of all ages filled the rooms, working on projects, laughing, and learning. "This is incredible," Linda said, her voice filled with admiration. "You've created something truly special." Jamal shrugged modestly. "It's not just me. A lot of people helped." Linda placed a hand on his shoulder. But you were the spark, Jamal. Never forget that. The success of Future Builders began to draw attention beyond the community. Local businesses offered funding and resources, and media outlets ran stories about Jamal's work. He was invited to speak at schools, conferences, and even national events. Each time, he shared the same message. No matter where you come from, you can make a difference. But Jamal remained grounded. He still lived in the same neighborhood, still spent his afternoons at the community center, and still worked side by side with the kids he was trying to help. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jamal sat on the rooftop of the community center. The metal hung around his neck, but this time it felt lighter. Beside him sat Linda and Mr. Rodriguez, both sipping cups of tea. "You've come a long way," Mr. Rodriguez said, his voice filled with pride. Jamal nodded, gazing out at the city skyline. "I couldn't have done it without all of you." Linda smiled. "That's the beauty of it, Jamal. You're building something bigger than yourself. And that's what real heroes do." Jamal leaned back, the cool evening breeze ruffling his hair. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace, not because the journey was over, but because he finally understood his purpose. The bridge between worlds. A year had passed since Jamal stood on the stage at the White House, a medal hanging around his neck, uncertain of his place in the world. Now he walked through the bustling community center that had become a beacon of hope, its walls adorned with colorful murals and photographs of smiling kids. The halls buzzed with activity, laughter, conversations, and the occasional clatter of chairs being moved for the next workshop. Jamal's initiative, Future Builders, had grown beyond his wildest dreams. What began as a small local program had evolved into a network of partnerships with schools, businesses, and other community centers across the city. Jamal had become more than a symbol of hope. He was a leader. Yet he carried the weight of his responsibilities with humility. Still the same boy who had once clutched a frayed backpack and wondered if he belonged. The catalyst for change. One afternoon, Jamal received an email that made his heart skip. The subject line read, "Collaboration Proposal, National Youth Empowerment Fund." It was from a prominent organization that worked with underprivileged communities nationwide. He called a meeting with his closest advisors, including Linda, who had become an integral part of his team, and Mr. Rodriguez, the community center's wise mentor. They gathered in a modest conference room, the walls decorated with kids' artwork. "This is huge," Jamal said, pacing as he read aloud portions of the email. "They want us to pilot a mentorship program that can be scaled to cities across the country. They've seen what we've done here, and they think we can help others replicate it." Linda leaned forward, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "It's a chance to take what you've built and bring it to communities that need it most. But it's also a big responsibility." Mr. Rodriguez nodded. "Scaling up means more resources, more people, and more challenges. But Jamal, if anyone can handle it, it's you." Jamal sat down, his hands resting on the table. He thought about the kids who looked up to him, the mentors who had shaped his own journey, and the promises he had made to himself. "Let's do it," he said finally, his voice steady. "Let's show them what we can do." The expansion. The months that followed were a whirlwind. Jamal traveled to cities he had only heard about, meeting with local leaders, educators, and community advocates. Each visit strengthened his resolve. He heard stories that mirrored his own. Kids struggling against the odds, parents desperate to give their children a better future, and neighborhoods brimming with untapped potential. One visit, in particular, stood out. Jamal traveled to a city in the Midwest, where a once thriving factory town had been devastated by economic decline. The local community center was in disrepair, its programs barely hanging on due to lack of funding. Yet the people there radiated a quiet determination. Jamal met with a group of kids in a dimly lit room filled with broken chairs and old books. Despite the setting, their enthusiasm was palpable as they shared their dreams of becoming artists, doctors, and engineers. "You remind me of where I started," Jamal told them, his voice filled with emotion. "And I promise you, things can change. You can change them." With the support of the National Youth Empowerment Fund, Future Builders helped revitalize the center. They provided funding for new resources, trained local mentors, and launched workshops tailored to the community's unique needs. Jamal returned 6 months later to find the center transformed. The once dreary building now buzzed with life, and the kids he had met were thriving. The recognition. As Future Builders gained momentum, the media began to take notice. Jamal was invited to speak at conferences, featured in documentaries, and even appeared on a popular talk show. During one interview, the host asked, "Jamal, you've accomplished so much at such a young age. What drives you to keep going?" Jamal thought for a moment before answering. "When I was a kid, there were so many times I felt invisible, like no one cared about what happened to me. But my community showed me that wasn't true. They lifted me up, and now it's my turn to do the same for others. It's not about being the hero. It's about building something bigger than yourself." The audience erupted in applause, and Jamal felt a surge of pride, not for himself, but for the movement he had helped create. The personal sacrifice. As much as Jamal loved his work, it came with sacrifices. His days were long, filled with meetings, events, and travel. He often missed quiet moments with the Harrison family, who had become his rock. Mrs. Harrison's health had stabilized, and she remained his fiercest supporter, often joining him at local events. One evening, after a particularly grueling week, Jamal returned home to find Mrs. Harrison waiting for him in the kitchen. "You've been working so hard," she said, placing a cup of tea in front of him. "I worry you're not taking enough time for yourself." Jamal smiled wearily. "There's just so much to do. I feel like if I stop, I'll let people down." Mrs. Harrison reached across the table and took his hand. "Jamal, you can't pour from an empty cup. The work you're doing is important, but so is your well-being. Promise me you'll find moments to rest." Jamal nodded, her words sinking in. He realized that caring for himself was just as important as caring for others. The bridge between worlds. Jamal's journey had taken him far from where he started, but he never forgot his roots. He often returned to his old neighborhood, where the kids greeted him like a celebrity. On one visit, he found little Tommy, now 9 years old, standing proudly in front of a science project he had built with the help of Future Builders. "I want to be an engineer," Tommy announced, grinning from ear to ear. Jamal knelt beside him, his heart swelling with pride. "And you will be. Just keep working hard." As Jamal walked through the familiar streets, he reflected on how much had changed. The boy who once felt out of place now belonged in both worlds, the slum that raised him and the broader community he was helping to build. The legacy. Years later, Jamal stood at the groundbreaking ceremony for the Future Builders National Headquarters. The state-of-the-art facility would serve as a hub for programs, training, and outreach. Surrounding him were the people who had supported him from the beginning. Linda, Mr. Rodriguez, the Harrisons, and dozens of kids whose lives had been changed by his work. In his speech, Jamal looked out at the crowd, his voice filled with gratitude and determination. "This isn't just my story, it's ours," he said. "It's about what we can accomplish when we believe in each other. Together, we're not just building futures, we're building a better world." As the crowd erupted in applause, Jamal felt the same sense of purpose that had carried him through his journey. He had turned a moment of bravery into a lifetime of impact, and he knew the best was yet to come. A future woven together. The ribbon-cutting ceremony at the Future Builders National Headquarters marked a turning point not just for Jamal, but for the entire movement he had built. The crowd that gathered on that sunny afternoon represented every facet of his journey. Kids from his old neighborhood, business leaders who had become critical partners, mentors who had guided him, and families who had benefited from the programs. Jamal stood at the center of it all, his hand resting on the oversized ceremonial scissors. "On the count of 3, said the event organizer, her voice amplified over the speakers. 1, 2, 3. The ribbon fell away, and the crowd erupted into cheers. Jamal smiled, the weight of the moment settling over him. But even as the celebration unfolded, he couldn't help but think about the future, about what this new chapter would mean for the people who would become his family, and for the kids who would one day walk through the doors of this building, bringing the vision to life. The national headquarters quickly became a hub of activity. Its sleek, modern design housed classrooms, mentorship spaces, and even a technology lab equipped with state-of-the-art tools. Every corner of the building reflected Jamal's vision, a space where kids could dream without limits and learn the skills to make those dreams a reality. Jamal's role shifted as the organization expanded. He was no longer just the face of Future Builders. He was a strategist, an advocate, and a mentor. His days were filled with meetings to secure funding, interviews with media outlets, and brainstorming sessions with his growing team. But Jamal insisted on keeping his work grounded. He spent time with the kids in the programs, listening to their stories and helping them with their projects. He believed that staying connected to the people he served was the only way to ensure the work remained meaningful. One day, while visiting a robotics workshop, Jamal met a boy named Caleb. The shy 12-year-old had a knack for building intricate machines but struggled with confidence. Jamal spent the afternoon working alongside him, offering encouragement and sharing his own experiences. "You remind me of myself," Jamal told him as they adjusted the gears on Caleb's latest invention. "Don't ever think you're not good enough. The world needs your ideas." Caleb beamed, his shoulders straightening as if the weight of doubt had been lifted. Moments like these reminded Jamal why he had started Future Builders in the first place, balancing growth with legacy. As Future Builders grew, so did the challenges. Balancing the demands of a national organization while staying true to the mission wasn't easy. There were disagreements over priorities, debates about funding allocation, and occasional criticism from those who questioned whether the organization could maintain its authenticity on a larger scale. Jamal tackled these challenges head-on, often leaning on the advice of the people he trusted most. Linda had become his unofficial advisor, offering practical solutions and a calming presence during stressful times. Mr. Rodriguez, though retired, still served as a sounding board, his years of experience invaluable. "Scaling up doesn't mean losing your way," Mr. Rodriguez reminded Jamal during one late-night conversation. "It means finding new ways to stay rooted in your values. Don't forget where you came from." Those words became a guiding principle for Jamal. He made sure Future Builders invested in local leadership, empowering communities to shape programs based on their unique needs. He also established a scholarship fund named after the community center where his journey began, ensuring that kids from his neighborhood always had access to opportunities. A family united. Through it all, the Harrison family remained Jamal's anchor. Mrs. Harrison, now thriving after years of health challenges, often joined him at events, her quiet strength inspiring everyone she met. Mr. Harrison, who had become a steadfast advocate for Future Builders, worked tirelessly behind the scenes to secure corporate partnerships and support. Jamal's bond with his adoptive parents deepened as they navigated this journey together. One evening, while they sat on the back porch of their home, Jamal shared his fears about the future. "What if I can't keep this up?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Harrison placed a comforting hand on his. "You've already done more than anyone could have imagined, Jamal. But remember, you're not doing this alone. You have a family, a team, and a whole community behind you." Mr. Harrison nodded. "And don't forget, son, you've built something that will outlast any one person. That's the real mark of success." Jamal felt the weight of their words settle in his heart, steadying him. A call to action. The following year, Jamal was invited to speak at the United Nations Youth Forum. The invitation was both an honor and an opportunity to share the lessons he had learned on a global stage. Standing at the podium, surrounded by young leaders from around the world, Jamal felt a familiar mix of nerves and determination. He glanced at the medal pinned to his label, a reminder of the journey that had brought him here. "When I was 11, he began, his voice steady. "I thought bravery was something big, something that made headlines. But I've learned that real bravery is in the small, quiet choices we make every day. It's in showing up for others, even when it's hard. It's in believing that change is possible, even when the odds are against you." The room was silent as he continued. "We all have the power to be builders, not just of structures, but of futures. Together, we can create a world where every child, no matter where they come from, has the chance to thrive. But it starts with us, with what we choose to do today." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Jamal's thoughts were already on what came next, a life interwoven with purpose. As Jamal walked through the halls of the national headquarters one evening, he paused to look at a mural that had been painted by the kids in the program. It depicted a tree, its roots deep and sprawling, its branches reaching high into the sky. Each root and branch was inscribed with words like courage, kindness, and hope. Jamal traced his fingers over the word community, a smile tugging at his lips. This tree, he realized, was a perfect metaphor for everything future builders stood for. Strong roots grounding it in the past, while its branches stretched toward the endless possibilities of the future. He turned and walked down the hall, where the voices of kids echoed from the classrooms. Their laughter and chatter filled him with a sense of peace. He had come a long way from the boy who boarded that plane, clutching his worn backpack and wondering if he mattered. Now he knew the answer. Jamal's journey was far from over, but one thing was clear. His life had become a bridge between worlds, between past and future, and between despair and hope. And as long as there were futures to build, Jamal would keep walking that bridge, hand in hand with the people who had always believed in him. The ripple effect. Years had passed since Jamal stood at the White House, a young boy unsure of his place in the world. Today, he walked through the bustling campus of Future Builders University, a sprawling institution born from the same vision that started in a small community center. The university wasn't just a place for higher education. It was a hub for innovation, mentorship, and empowerment, a living testament to how far his movement had come. Jamal paused in the courtyard, watching students from diverse backgrounds gather under the shade of towering oak trees. They were debating ideas, planning projects, and sharing their dreams. Dreams that, for many of them, had once seemed impossible. A young woman approached him, clutching a notebook filled with sketches. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice filled with nervous excitement, "I wanted to thank you. If it weren't for Future Builders, I wouldn't be here. I'm studying engineering now, and one day I want to design sustainable housing for communities like the one I grew up in." Jamal smiled warmly, the same pride he always felt swelling in his chest. "It's not just me," he replied. "It's all of us. You're part of the change now, too." The evolution of Future Builders. The growth of Future Builders had been nothing short of extraordinary. The organization now operated in over 50 cities across the country, with partnerships that extended internationally. Programs ranged from mentorship initiatives to career readiness workshops, scholarships, and even housing support for families in need. Every project carried the same ethos: to empower individuals while strengthening communities. One of the most groundbreaking expansions was the creation of Future Labs, a program dedicated to teaching cutting-edge technology skills to underserved youth. From coding bootcamps to robotics competitions, Future Labs had already launched hundreds of students into careers in tech and engineering. Jamal's leadership had also evolved. While he still visited local communities and connected directly with the kids in the programs, much of his time was spent building partnerships, advocating for policy changes, and ensuring the sustainability of the organization. His office walls were lined with photos, not of awards, but of the people whose lives had been transformed by Future Builders. An unexpected reunion. One sunny afternoon, as Jamal prepared for a meeting with government officials to discuss expanding his programs into rural areas, his assistant knocked on the door. "There's someone here to see you," she said, her tone unusually soft. "He says he's from your old neighborhood." Curious, Jamal stepped into the reception area, where a man in his mid-30s stood. His face was familiar, though time and life had added lines and scars that Jamal didn't remember. The man's eyes lit up when he saw him. "Jamal," the man said, his voice warm and slightly raspy. "It's been a long time." Jamal froze for a moment before recognition clicked. "Marcus?" he asked, his voice filled with surprise. Marcus, one of Jamal's closest friends from his childhood, nodded. The two embraced, and for a moment, it felt as though no time had passed. Revisiting the past. Over coffee in Jamal's office, Marcus shared his story. After Jamal had left the neighborhood, Marcus had struggled to find his path. He had dabbled in construction work, fallen into some bad decisions, and eventually found himself in prison. But during his time there, he discovered a passion for woodworking and mentoring others. "Your story kept coming up," Marcus said, his voice steady but emotional. "People would talk about you, how you turned your life around, how you didn't forget where you came from. It made me think, maybe I could change too." Jamal listened intently, his heart heavy yet hopeful. "And now?" he asked. Marcus smiled. "I've been working with a nonprofit that teaches trade skills to people coming out of prison. I help guys like me get a second chance." Jamal leaned back in his chair, a sense of pride washing over him. "That's incredible, Marcus. You're doing exactly what Future Builders is all about, lifting people up." As they talked, an idea began to form. Jamal had always believed in bridging gaps between different communities, and Marcus's work aligned perfectly with that vision. By the end of their conversation, they had agreed to collaborate, creating a new program within Future Builders to support reentry and workforce development for formerly incarcerated individuals. A global stage. As Future Builders continued to expand, Jamal found himself increasingly in demand on the global stage. He was invited to speak at international conferences, advising governments and organizations on how to create inclusive systems that empowered marginalized communities. One such trip took him to Nairobi, Kenya, where he visited a local nonprofit working to provide education and healthcare in underserved areas. The visit deeply moved him, reminding him of the universal struggles faced by disadvantaged communities around the world. Jamal forged a partnership with the organization, sharing resources and expertise to create a pilot program that combined Future Builders' mentorship model with local cultural practices. During a speech at the United Nations, Jamal addressed a room filled with world leaders, activists, and changemakers. "Empowerment isn't just about giving people tools," he said, his voice strong and clear. "It's about believing in their potential. When we invest in communities, when we see the value in every life, we create ripples that can change the world." The next generation of builders. Back at the national headquarters, Jamal walked through the halls with a sense of fulfillment. One of the most significant milestones for him was the emergence of the next generation of leaders within Future Builders. Many of the kids who had once been part of the programs were now running them. Caleb, the shy boy Jamal had mentored years ago, was now the director of Future Labs, developing new curriculum and inspiring kids to pursue careers in technology. Maria, one of the first scholarship recipients, had become a lawyer advocating for educational equity. Everywhere Jamal looked, he saw the fruits of the seeds that had been planted long ago. Reflecting on the journey. One evening, Jamal sat on the rooftop of the national headquarters, a familiar place of reflection for him. The city skyline stretched out before him, its lights twinkling like a sea of possibilities. Beside him sat Linda, who had remained a steadfast friend and mentor throughout his journey. "You've built something incredible," Linda said, her voice filled with admiration. "But I don't think it's just the programs or the buildings. It's the connections. You've brought people together in a way that lasts." Jamal nodded, his gaze distant. "It's not about me," he said. "It never was. It's about what happens when people believe in each other." Linda smiled. "And that, Jamal, is your legacy." Looking ahead, Jamal's journey was far from over. There were still challenges to face, communities to support, and lives to transform. But as he sat on that rooftop, surrounded by the echoes of laughter and learning from below, he felt a deep sense of peace. The boy who had once boarded a plane with trembling hands had grown into a man who had changed the lives of thousands. And yet, he remained the same in the ways that mattered most, rooted in kindness, guided by courage, and committed to building a brighter future for everyone. Building bridges across continents. Years into his journey as a changemaker, Jamal found himself at a crossroads. Future Builders had grown into a nationwide movement, with its programs thriving in schools, neighborhoods, and cities across the United States. But Jamal's vision extended beyond borders. The partnerships he had forged in Kenya and other countries during his international travels planted the seeds of an even larger idea, a global initiative that would connect underserved communities worldwide. The question now was how to turn that dream into reality. The call to expand. One crisp autumn morning, Jamal sat in his office at Future Builders National Headquarters, reviewing a proposal from the Global Impact Coalition, an international nonprofit that specialized in education and resource sharing between developing nations. They wanted to partner with Future Builders to create a global mentorship network, one that would pair kids from different countries with mentors who could help them navigate their challenges. The idea resonated deeply with Jamal. He thought back to his own childhood, to the mentors who had shaped his life, and believed in him when he couldn't yet see his own potential. The opportunity to extend that same support to kids across continents felt both daunting and exciting. Jamal called a meeting with his core team, which now included leaders who had risen through the ranks of Future Builders. People like Caleb, the director of Future Labs, and Maria, the legal advocate turned policy strategist. They gathered in the conference room, its walls lined with photos of children and families whose lives had been transformed. "This could be the next chapter for us," Jamal said, addressing the team. "But it's a huge step. We'll need resources, partnerships, and a solid plan to make it work." Caleb nodded thoughtfully. "If we can get the tech infrastructure in place, we could make virtual mentorship a reality. Kids in rural Kenya could connect with mentors in New York, or students in Detroit could learn from educators in Ghana. The possibilities are endless." Maria added, "But we need to be careful about cultural nuances. We can't just copy-paste what works here and expect it to succeed elsewhere. We'll need local leaders to guide the programs." Jamal smiled. "Exactly. This has to be a collaborative effort. It's not about exporting our model. It's about creating something new together." Launching the global initiative. The following year was a whirlwind of activity. Jamal and his team traveled to countries in Africa, Asia, and South America, meeting with community leaders, educators, and government officials. Each visit deepened Jamal's understanding of the unique challenges faced by different regions. In a remote village in India, he met a group of young girls who were passionate about education but faced significant barriers, including societal expectations and limited access to schools. In Brazil, he toured a favela where kids were using recycled materials to build makeshift science projects, their ingenuity shining despite their lack of resources. In Ghana, he visited a school where teachers were using traditional storytelling to teach complex concepts. These experiences shaped the framework of the global initiative, which they named Bridge Builders. The program would focus on 3 pillars: mentorship, education, and resource sharing. It would leverage technology to connect communities while prioritizing the voices of local leaders to ensure programs were culturally relevant. A new kind of ceremony. The official launch of Bridge Builders took place at a global summit in Geneva. The event brought together leaders from all over the world, including many who had partnered with Future Builders over the years. Jamal was the keynote speaker, a role that still felt surreal despite his years of public speaking. Standing on the stage, Jamal looked out at the audience, a sea of faces representing every corner of the globe. He took a deep breath, the weight of the moment settling over him. "When I was a kid," he began, his voice steady, "I thought my world was small. I thought the struggles I faced were mine alone. But as I grew, I realized that our challenges, poverty, lack of access to education, inequality, aren't confined to one neighborhood, one city, or even one country. They're universal, and so is the potential to overcome them. He paused, letting his words sink in. Bridge Builders is about more than connecting people. It's about creating a world where no child feels invisible, where every community has the resources to thrive, and where we all recognize that we're stronger together. This is just the beginning. The applause that followed was deafening, but what struck Jamal most were the conversations that took place afterward. Leaders from different countries approached him with ideas, educators shared their hopes for their students, and young people spoke passionately about their dreams for the future. A personal milestone. As Bridge Builders took off, Jamal's life grew even busier, but he remained committed to staying grounded, often returning to his hometown to visit the community center where it all began. One such visit coincided with the center's annual award ceremony, an event that honored kids who had excelled in academics, arts, and community service. Jamal sat in the audience, clapping and cheering as each child was recognized. When the ceremony ended, Mrs. Harrison approached him, her eyes sparkling with pride. "They're following in your footsteps," she said, gesturing to the kids. "You've created something that will outlast all of us." Jamal smiled, his heart full. "They're building their own paths," he said. "I'm just here to cheer them on." Challenges and triumphs. The global expansion wasn't without its hurdles. Cultural misunderstandings, logistical issues, and funding gaps tested Jamal and his team at every turn. But for every challenge, there was a breakthrough. Like the time a mentorship program in Uganda helped a young girl secure a scholarship to study engineering, or when a rural school in Indonesia used Bridge Builders' resources to launch a literacy campaign that reached hundreds of kids. Jamal often reflected on these victories during quiet moments in his office. The stories of lives transformed reminded him why he had started this journey, and they fueled his determination to keep going. A legacy in the making. As the years went by, Jamal began to think about the future of future builders and bridge builders. He knew that his role as a leader wasn't just about guiding the organization. It was about ensuring that it could thrive without him. He began mentoring a group of emerging leaders within the organization, sharing his experiences and encouraging them to bring their own ideas to the table. One of those leaders was Caleb, who had grown into a confident and visionary strategist. During a team retreat, Jamal pulled Caleb aside. "You're ready to take on more responsibility," he said. "I want you to lead the next phase of Bridge Builders." Caleb's eyes widened. "Are you sure? Those are big shoes to fill." Jamal chuckled. "It's not about filling my shoes. It's about walking your own path. I trust you." The endless journey. One evening, as Jamal sat on the rooftop of his home, a tradition that had stayed with him since his youth, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. From a scared boy on a plane to a global advocate, his life had been a series of steps, each one building on the last. The stars above seemed to twinkle with infinite possibilities. Jamal smiled, knowing that his work was far from finished. There were still bridges to build, futures to shape, and lives to touch. And with every step forward, he carried the lessons of his past, the support of his community, and the unshakable belief that even the smallest act of kindness could create ripples that changed the world. The torch passed, the flame burns brighter. As the organization expanded, Jamal's role began to shift. He was no longer the hands-on, everyday leader of future builders and bridge builders. Instead, he became a guiding force, a mentor to those who would carry the torch forward. It wasn't an easy transition, but it was one Jamal had been preparing for. He knew that to create a sustainable legacy, he had to empower others to lead. The Global Summit of Builders. The first ever Global Summit of Builders brought together thousands of participants from over 50 countries. Hosted in a sprawling convention center in Cape Town, South Africa, the summit featured workshops, keynote speeches, and interactive exhibits showcasing the impact of bridge builders. Jamal arrived early, walking through the nearly empty halls as volunteers set up booths and banners. He felt a surge of pride and nostalgia seeing the diversity of displays. An exhibit from a Kenyan school showcasing how they used mentorship to improve literacy rates, a robotics project by kids in Detroit, and photos of women in India learning trades to support their families. This wasn't just a celebration. It was proof that his vision had taken root in places he had never imagined. The opening ceremony was electric. Caleb, now the director of Bridge Builders, gave the keynote speech, his voice resonating with confidence and conviction. "Today, we celebrate what happens when we connect," Caleb said. "When we share knowledge, resources, and compassion, we don't just change individual lives. We transform communities, countries, and the world." As the audience erupted in applause, Jamal watched from the sidelines, his heart swelling with pride. Caleb had grown into a leader in his own right, someone who embodied the principles of future builders while bringing his unique perspective to the table. The final project. Although Jamal had stepped back from day-to-day operations, there was one project he still held close to his heart: the revitalization of his childhood neighborhood. Despite all his achievements, the streets where he had grown up still bore the scars of neglect and poverty. Jamal was determined to change that. With the support of local leaders, philanthropists, and his team, Jamal spearheaded the creation of the Legacy Hub, a multi-purpose community center designed to serve as a model for neighborhoods around the world. The hub would include a library, a tech lab, a child care center, and spaces for art and vocational training. Construction was a community effort. Volunteers from all walks of life, former program participants, local residents, and even kids, pitched in to bring the project to life. Jamal often rolled up his sleeves, joining the work crews and sharing stories of his childhood with the younger volunteers. A homecoming to remember. The grand opening of the Legacy Hub was a day of celebration and reflection. The streets were lined with banners, music filled the air, and the neighborhood buzzed with excitement. Jamal stood at the entrance, surrounded by the people who had been part of his journey. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had taught him how to dream beyond the boundaries of his environment, held his hand as tears streamed down her face. Mr. Harrison, his adoptive father, stood proudly by his side, his hand resting on Jamal's shoulder. "This is more than a building," Jamal said during his speech, addressing the crowd that had gathered. "This is a promise that no matter where you come from, you matter, and that when we lift each other up, there's nothing we can't achieve." The ribbon was cut, and the crowd surged inside. Children ran to explore the library. Artists set up easels in the creative spaces, and parents signed up for vocational training courses. The hub was alive with possibility, a tangible reminder of what community could accomplish. The next generation speaks. As Jamal walked through the hub later that evening, he came across a group of kids working on a mural in one of the hallways. The painting depicted a tree, its roots deep and sprawling, its branches stretching toward the sky, a familiar motif. Beneath it, the kids were writing messages of hope. One boy looked up from his work and asked, "Mr. Thompson, what made you believe you could do all this?" Jamal knelt beside him, his voice gentle but firm. "I didn't always believe I could, but there were people who believed in me, my family, my community, my mentors. They showed me that when you believe in someone, you give them the power to believe in themselves." The boy nodded, smiling. "I want to do that too." Passing the torch. As the years went by, Jamal continued to mentor and inspire, but he also began to spend more time focusing on his personal life. He had found balance, a difficult but necessary journey. He often returned to the Harrison household, where he would share meals with his parents and talk about how far they had come as a family. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Mrs. Harrison looked at Jamal with a wistful smile. "You've built something extraordinary," she said, "but don't forget to live, Jamal. You've given so much of yourself. Make sure you keep some of that for you." Her words stayed with him. Over time, Jamal began to find joy in the quieter moments. teaching a kid to tie a tie before a job interview, watching a play written by a group of teens in the theater program, or simply walking through his neighborhood and seeing the changes he had helped create. A legacy secured. One summer afternoon, Jummel sat in a park near the Legacy Hub, watching children play on the swings and families gather for picnics. He was joined by Linda, who had remained one of his closest confidants. "You've done it, Jamal," Linda said, her voice filled with admiration. "You've created something that will outlive us all." Jamal smiled, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's not about me. It never was. It's about them. The kids, the families, the communities. They're the ones who will carry this forward." Linda nodded. "And they will, because you showed them how." The final speech. Years later, Jamal was invited to give a speech at the 25th anniversary of Future Builders. Standing on the same stage where Caleb had once delivered his first keynote, Jamal addressed a crowd that now spanned generations. "This isn't just a celebration of what we've done," he said, his voice strong. "It's a challenge for what we'll do next. The work of building futures is never finished. It's a torch we pass, a flame that burns brighter every time we light it in someone else's heart." As he stepped off the stage, Jamal looked around at the faces of the leaders, mentors, and kids who had become part of his life. He felt a deep sense of peace. The boy who once doubted his worth had become a man who built bridges, sparked change, and left a legacy that would endure. The torch burns on. As Jamal walked into the sunset, the laughter of children echoing behind him, he knew that the seeds he had planted would continue to grow, nurtured by the hands of those who believed in a brighter tomorrow. His work wasn't just about building futures. It was about building a world where everyone had a place, a purpose, and the power to make a difference.